good.
YouTube, what is up? I am currently 5 days out from my pro debut at Chicago Pro next weekend. I was telling Justin earlier today that I'm getting to the point where I feel like I need a bike helmet, just like walking around existing. And he said he had a funny story about that.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I was a kid in the '80s. So there was like no laws for children. It was just like the Wild West, and we lived about a mile from the school. I think I'm assuming it was a mile because wherever it was, one block farther away from the school got picked up from the bus. Where I lived, you weren't allowed to get picked up by the bus. Even though I was 6 years old, walking a mile through town to school, they didn't care. So early on, like the first week of school, my mom, because back then they didn't have any, they didn't know who was on the bus. So the first week I just like walked the opposite direction and pretended I lived over there. It's not like, now where they have lists and everything. Well, eventually they figured that out. Well, it turns out my Aunt Phyllis was a bus driver. And so my mom worked out a deal where I could ride on my Aunt Phyllis's bus, and she would just make a special trip at the end after she dropped everyone else off and dropped me off at home. This is a small town, Capac, Michigan. It's called. If you know what Michigan looks like, it looks like a mitten, or it's like kind of right here. It's one of those towns. It's spelled forwards and backwards to make it easy for everyone to remember. You could drive through it in neutral. It's a one stoplight. Not really a stoplight. It's a flashing red when it works. Anyway, so I get on this bus, and it's a little shorter than the buses I typically had seen. I had not yet learned what the short bus was, but I did learn. I did learn rather quickly because the kid I sat down and I look at the kid in the seat across from me, and he's got a football helmet on. And as a 6-year-old, I thought that's awesome. He gets to wear a football helmet to school. I thought it was awesome until I look over and he was banging his head against the wall. And then of course all the kids at school saw, and they, me being the naive kid that I was, didn't know what the short bus was. But of course, every other kid in school knew exactly what the short bus was.
So they saw you getting off the short bus.
Oh yes, yeah. And I tried to explain that, my Aunt Phyllis drove, but having your Aunt Phyllis cart you around isn't really, that's not like a baller statement. So that didn't help me at all. So I ended up, I just talked my parents into letting me walk home. But the walk home was actually interesting because we were telling my kids about these stories. We went camping a couple of summers ago, and I was telling them, because they think it's hilarious what it was like in the '80s. Because we used to just ride our bike into town to get cigarettes for my buddy's mom, cigarettes and whiskey. They would just give them to you, because they'd call your mom after, and my mom didn't smoke, but it was Mike Troop, his mom did. They'd call him, ask if they got cigarettes, and they'd, yell if you didn't give them to her. No one cared that you were 6 years old smoking, but the path I had to walk home, thinking back now, is like hilarious that it was just allowed. So I had to walk down this alley where there was like a laundromat, but in the back of the laundromat, it was like a storage shed kind of thing. And this was like the early '80s when Pac-Man and stuff was out. Well, they turned it into an arcade center. But arcade centers are generally seedy to begin with. You're like, especially early '80s, it wasn't like it wasn't like, Kids Bop Fun Center. It was like pot smoking, place where people who had no business being outside of work at 2 p.m. on a Monday, but were hung out. So we had to walk by that, and then I had to walk down train tracks where there was a caboose that they had parked off on, like the tracks kind of merge off, like an end stop. There's a little caboose there, and there was a guy named Crazy Tom, who we said
lived in the caboose behind the tracks. Oh my god!
Well, he was an old Vietnam vet. We called him Crazy Tom because he talked to himself. I'm sure he was schizophrenic. We thought he lived there in the caboose. No one lives in a caboose, but when you're a kid,
boxcar kids did.
Yeah. I mean, it made sense. You watch cartoons, Pippi Longstocking, people lived in cabooses. But Crazy Tom, he's a really good guy because he used if you paid him $1, he would take your pair of your jeans and draw a dragon on it, like all the way up from the cuff all the way up to the waistband, like a big dragon. Really well done. I mean, I thought it was well done at the time. Who knows if it was good or not? But I couldn't draw. I could barely write my name. But yeah, I mean, subsequently, that was also a time I learned I was an ugly kid because it's a blessing and a curse because being an ugly kid, Crazy Tom never touched me, but the the consolation prize was I was an ugly kid that Crazy Tom didn't want to touch. But yeah, that's my bike helmet story.
Oh my God,
So
I
I don't
love
know
it.
whatever happened to that kid. Yeah, actually, there's other stories too. There was another really huge kid. I probably rode the bus maybe 2, 3, 4 times before like getting made fun of was too much, and I didn't care. I was going to take my chances getting raped by Crazy Tom rather than ride the bus. But there was this big, huge kid, and there was a sign, like no parking or something on the fence while we waited for the bus. And one of the kids that thought he was cool went and punched it, and then like everyone was kind of punching it to see how far they could make it wobble. Well, this big, huge kid, I don't know what. I mean, he rode the short bus, but I don't know what was the symptom. But there's a certain kind of strength that people talk about that he definitely had. So he came running up full speed, hit this sign on this fence. We're like kids. Fence just went wobbling, 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 and you could see like it really hurt him. Well, he came back to school the next day at a full arm cast. I think he broke like
Oh,
every
shut up,
bone in his arm.
seriously?
Yeah, and just well, when you're a kid, the amount of pain you can hide to
Yeah.
not be embarrassed in front of your friends is astounding.
Yeah.
He didn't even make a whimper. Went all the way home,
That is so
but
funny.
yeah, okay, that's my story.
That's awesome. It's so funny, like, just knowing you and hearing how you grew up and some of these things, because I think people on the internet, they're like, oh, Justin Harris, and, for good reason. They're like, oh, he's brilliant, he's a physicist, and you are. But it's really, really fun hearing just these different stories that you have, too.
Yeah, I grew
It's
up in a tiny
humanizing.
little, yeah, I mean, like a trailer when I was little, and then we moved up to a house that I never knew my address. I just told my friends it was the house that didn't have paint on it. So, which my parents found out and got really mad. So they hired painters, which was, again, I don't know how much of this is the '80s and how much is this me growing up in a hillbilly small town. But back then, when you hired painters, what it meant was you got like 10 cases of beer and some steaks, and all the men in the neighborhood came over and got drunk and painted your house. And so they
That's a
overheard me
very
telling,
Midwest thing to do.
yeah,
Have
oh
you
yeah, yeah.
seen
And it just like,
Have you seen the comedian Charlie Barron's?
I
You'd like
kind of
it.
name sounds familiar.
Oh
What
man.
was the clip?
So
Midwest Nice.
I
is
grew
the
up
famous
in
clip.
Illinois, and I went up to Minnesota every summer. My dad grew up in Minnesota. That was like our things. We go up to the Boundary Waters, we go fishing, and this comedian basically makes his entire living off of that like Midwest, like, whoop, don't you know?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, oh
and
yeah, yeah,
he's
no,
got
yeah,
one
yeah, no.
called Midwest Nice. Midwest Nice Part 2 is the best one for anyone watching. If you're from the Midwest, go look up Charlie Barron's. He's hysterical. He's got some really, really good ones. You'd
Yeah, no, it was. I love my like. It's very different than like my kids' childhood now because it was, like we just have like there'd always be like a big bonfire somewhere, and it was never planned. It was like some dad probably got drunk and like tried to like tore apart a bunk bed and then just decided to
just
burn
light it
it,
on
and then
fire.
everyone just kind of congregate and you'd be all. But yeah, it was a yeah, fun little tiny little hick town.
Yeah, those are the good days.
Yeah, now you got rules and laws and child labor
Can't set
laws.
things
Yeah,
on fire anymore.
bunch of bullshit.
Can't rape kids. I mean, there's nothing.
Oh, you want to talk about how you're feeling at 5 days out?
Yeah.
So this week was tough too because my whole thing through prep has been I want to make sure I'm saying yes to a lot of things that are important. And I was texting both of you guys about, trying to balance making sure that I'm not totally overexerting myself, saying yes to everything, and also going to the important things. And this week, I was brought on as a gasp athlete, which is great, incredible, really, really cool opportunity. But it also meant that I had some other commitments and obligations that by the end of this week, I came home on, I don't know what day it was. What day is today? Sunday?
Like Tuesday.
Well, so we went to the original Metroflex where like Ronnie and Branch trained on Tuesday. Coolest thing ever.
Had you been? Have you been? You guys been there before?
No.
I've still not been.
Was it smaller than
It
you were
was
expecting?
so much smaller than I expected.
It's like a storage shed.
It's
It blew
tiny.
my mind.
And it's
Yeah.
hot as balls in there. Like
Oh,
it's awful. But it's so cool. So it's one of those times where I was like, I'm literally 10 days out and I've got like, Olympians in the same room as me. And I'm like, well, you better like train hard. So, probably trained a little harder than I should have. And hung out in the heat all day with people like Branch and Martin Fitzwater and Darwin Uribe. which again is really cool. But now by the end of the week, I think through most of prep, I've done a pretty good job of being like, mind over matter. Like you're only as tired as you're going to tell as you're going to tell yourself you're tired. But I think the last 2 days, like
Yeah, you've been a zombie.
yeah, and I'm pretty high functioning even on like very little sleep. I'm pretty high functioning when I'm overloaded. But I hit an absolute wall this weekend after Dave's show last weekend, spending the entire day basically Tuesday, and then trying to catch up on work Tuesday night, and then the rest of the week. And I'm just now getting together my posing routine for pro debut.
It looks good. The routine looks good.
I hope so. It was cool. I posed with Branch and Martin on Friday.
Yes.
And Branch was like, you have no fat left to lose. You are super flat. You are ready. And when someone like Branch comments on your conditioning, you're like, okay, like I did all right. Because that's the
you're on point.
So that's pretty cool. But I'm definitely like,
And so you can feel that like the fat pads on your feet are gone.
oh my God. So still walking, I'm doing all my walking on an incline because what's less if you're, I'm me, I'm an asshole to myself. I'm like, let's go 10% incline just cause. But yeah, every time I go on a list walk now, it's like, it feels like I'm walking on pebbles or on shards of glass like the entire time because there's no fat left on my feet.
Yeah, so for the listeners who might not know that, there's two kind of like, I would say standard, like gold standard in my inside out shredded. And the first one is like, well, I'll say the first one is what Chad Nichols, I think, used to tell people, or maybe it was Tom Prince even, where they say, like, how do I know I'm ready? And he'd say, well, grab the skin on the knuckles of on the back of your hand. When every part of your body feels like that, then you're ready. You'll never get that lean. I'm pretty sure you die before then, but that'll let you know real quick when you grab that and then grab your lower back. And the other one is, and I remember Dorian talking about it years ago, is when you, I mean, because the cushioning on your feet is, I mean, what is cushioning? Like you can develop a callus, which is like thick skin, but most of it's fat. When that's gone, you're like, you ever see like those things where deer get like gangrene and then you see them because they're tough and they'll just walk on their bones?
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're doing.
It's the PT and he's like, oh my God, am I going to give myself a stress fracture? Because I've had that happen both other preps. Like, but it's fine. There's like 3 more cardio sessions left. Yeah.
Stress fractures heal.
What's that?
And stress fractures heal.
They do. I think that the first prep with you, I had a stress fracture like 12 weeks out or 10 weeks out.
That's because
we were still finished.
You had that because we had to use the Prowler
for sprints.
Because that was during COVID lockdowns and the gyms
yeah.
closed, and we ended up renting and then buying a Stairmaster, which was awesome. Well, it's not awesome, but it's awesome. But in the week between there, we had key fob access to a gym, thankfully, so we could still train, but they didn't have a Stairmaster, so we were doing like half-hour hit sessions on the Prowler. And I mean, I'm pretty resilient to injury, and like my feet hurt, and so
yeah,
Dani's like immunocompromised, and her
soft tissues. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I started this prep just hoping, honestly, not to get like third callouts. Like I wanted to at least go and like not suck was kind of my goal for this year because we moved. I had some family health issues come up. There was just a lot going on, and I felt like I was undersized. And I think as we've gone through prep, Justin, I had an email from you that was like, will you take a look in the mirror for a moment? And I really needed that. And I think having that email, and then there've been a couple of other people who've been like, if you show up, like you're really going to do well. So.
Well, like to go on what you said, it's like a common problem, like in all things. It's like you get people who've succeeded in nothing in their life who will talk about themselves like they're the greatest thing ever, and they have this weird overinflated, view of themselves. And then you get other people, like what I said. I think one of these podcasts actually, maybe I can't remember what I was like. I said, you turn pro your second show, and you were like, well, other people have done that. I'm like, yeah, not people who placed 17th. Other really good competitors turn pro quickly. And it's it's the type of person that. I mean, being the type of person who doesn't have that overinflated ego is kind of the reason you're doing those things. But sometimes you need.
It's always really interesting to me during prep because I learn more and more about myself, and I think this prep, what I've seen is how much of my upbringing really comes out, and I I've never failed at anything. I've always been, this is going to sound really ignorant, I've always been really good at everything I've done. And the idea of actually wanting to achieve more and more and more is, it's really scary to admit out loud that, like, coming in for my pro debut and, like, I want to win. I feel like an absolute asshole saying that out loud. Because who does that? Like, who goes into the pro debut and, you know, like, if I got second place,
People who win their pro
if I got
debut.
second place, I'd be pissed. You know, like,
Well, that I mean, that's the difference. I mean, there's people. This is your third prep, right? There's people who are doing their first non-novice competition as their third
Yeah.
prep, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they're not the type of people who say, "I want to win my pro debut, and I'm going to be pissed if I'm second." You know, there's like a standard, and nothing against any. You know, everyone has their reasons for doing things, and you know, for everything, but. I mean, I never apologize for demanding excellence of yourself. You know, I
I've
think,
never admitted out loud to anybody before this prep what I expected of myself. Not even Dave. And that's been the hardest thing for me about this prep is our two best friends have actually really challenged me to be like, if you want something, like, you can say those things out loud. And I think for listeners too, like, whether it's your first prep or you're not first prep or whatever, or it's something totally unrelated to bodybuilding, I think people are afraid to articulate their goals out loud, because as soon as you articulate those goals, they become very, very real. And the sense of potential failure is so high. And in a generation where we are so failure averse, that it feels like a big threat.
I think part of it also is, at least maybe for me, I feel like, because I'll see people, because you'll see like, you know, braggarts or something, and you'll see them brag and they don't achieve anything, you know, and so that, like, you can kind of get that view
Oh,
of, you
yeah.
know, there's
You're
talk
like, I don't want to be that person.
yeah, yeah, but when you're being a doer and doing the talking secondary, that's a totally different, you know, and then speaking things to existence, like, not to be, you know, foo-foo or whatever, but you know, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, put pressure on yourself. You know, you're already doing it mentally. You might as well do it. You know, throw it out to everyone.
Yeah. Works in training too. That's how I relate it too, because I haven't gone into a competition yet being like, I have to win. But no, people will come up and like, or to either of us, be like, well, they have like some goal that's just so not lofty. You know, like, I want to hit this for this many reps on like the hack squat. I'm like, you could do that today if you really tried. Like,
Yeah, and
yeah.
we could do a whole podcast on goals, stuff like that. Like, I don't even know how to describe it, but the people who set goals that they could achieve today and then don't achieve them anytime in the near future. It's like it's already there. And then conversely, people who set really lofty goals, but with no plan or path to get there. It's like, you know, you want to take, you know, that goal is 1,000 steps away. Well, you haven't taken a step in 3 weeks. You know, how are you, you know, and this sport is really bad with it, because there's usually like two types of people. There's the type of people who, I want to be pro, and they have every day, you know, planned out until, like, you know, this clear and defined path, you know, where, you know, no excuses. I'm doing this, then I qualify, then I do this, then if I don't win here, you know, I have to win. I just can't accept it. And then you have other people who are like, yeah, I'd like to turn pro, and that's it. You know, it's like, well, what did you do today to move closer to that goal?
I think how people talk about their goals just says so much about them too. Like, the way someone talks about something they care about, to me, says more about them than almost anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like we've talked before, like, you have to be good at self-assessment. But if you are capable of like legit self-assessment, and in that self-assessment, turning pro is a possibility, then it shouldn't be. You can say, you know, I'd like to, but in your mind you should be thinking, I will, because if it's a possibility, then it's a possibility. You know, like I remember a buddy of mine, Mike Hickey, said, I think his dad said or something. It's just a dumb little statement, but it was like, we were trying. I think like he wanted to buy a car that was broken down, and neither of us know how to fix a car. You know, I mean, back then, anyways. And his dad was like, "Can you read?" He's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Well, if you can read, you can do anything." And like that really stuck to me. I was like, "That's true." You know, I mean, it might be a lot of reading before you learn it, but someone else has read it and learned it. I mean, any topic, someone knows
I keep
it.
thinking too that, like, especially in light of competitions, whether it's like a big game or, you know, powerlifting or strongman or bodybuilding, whatever, someone's gonna win. You may as well try and be you. Like someone's walking out of that with a win.
Yeah,
You could apply it to like
yeah. And they didn't. They had a. They it didn't happen by
Right.
accident. They typically had a clear and structured path that they put everything into.
you could apply it to so many things too outside of bodybuilding, like competitive things still, like business. You know, like you're going to produce a product or a service. Someone's going to be in charge of it. Someone's going to own it and reap the benefits. Why can't it be you?
Yeah, and that's it. Yeah, like if you have a goal with business, that's the biggest thing for me recently is people always have, but there's no path. It's like, well, here, perfect example, like clothing. You know, like you want to do clothing. Well, I don't know anything about clothing, so what? I mean,
Yeah.
Google. How do I start it? You know, and then just each day you make a step forward and make a step forward, and you know, like or another good quote is, "What one person can do, so
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
another." You know.
Yeah, it's funny when we were just talking about Branch in a slightly different context, but I remember hearing some interview with him. He was talking about how he started Wicked Cuts, his beef jerky company, and I think someone who was going in on the business with him was, asked him, "Well, do you know anything about making jerky?" And he said, "No, but I can learn."
He's so
Yeah.
cool to be around.
Branch and Jay, like two, like their business minds around the sport. I mean, their work ethic in general. I think we've talked about that on the podcast too, about how people don't, like, it just blows my mind how people don't put that work ethic. If you can compete and get in true contest shape, there is nothing that will be as difficult as that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's crazy to me that like Branch and Jay, and I mean, there's more, but that so few bodybuilders put
What's
that
been
to
really
use.
cool about being around Branch this week too, and like, granted, I'm like, when I say I've been around him, I mean like we've had a couple conversations. He looked at my posing. I'm not like, oh yeah, we're like, but like it was really really cool. I got to sit across from him when the team all went out to lunch, and he mentioned two things that really stuck with me. Number one, do your homework. But then the other, he's really big on being a well-rounded, three-dimensional person. And I think for him, and probably for many of us, bodybuilding, training, all those things, like they really are a segue into being a well-rounded person. And so kind of like you were saying, like, if you can put in the effort to be absolutely shredded and contest lean and ready for stage, there's no reason you can't take that effort and make your life better in so many other ways for it. Because at the end of the day, like at some point, bodybuilding's going to be gone. You're going to be done. You will have stepped off the stage for the last time, and you will be a better person, more well-rounded for it, or you will have no idea and have a lot of identity role confusion in terms of who you are and what you're doing next. Justin, you probably know more about
Yeah,
that.
and if you don't have somewhere to point that passion, it's a hard.
Good.
I mean, I went through a hard phase trying to figure out. I mean, well, mine got pointed into physics for a while, which is probably a dumb path. I mean, it was really cool, but there's no money in it. But well, yeah, I mean, I realized quickly, like it's like the post contest blues. You know, like you hate prep, and prep is terrible, but everything feels so heightened and important. Every meal's important. Everything's make or break. You can't wait for it to be over because you can eat anything you want. But then when it's over, you're actually depressed because now things don't matter. It feels like it's not. I mean, it slowly transitions into now off season matters. But after like you get those first couple free meals in, it's like you almost feel lost. Like, well, now every 2 hours isn't make or break. It's like you get a similar thing when you're competition.
Did you feel that at all
too.
this week? So now that you're done with your show and you're kind of coming off the couple days of, rebounding and all that, how have you felt mentally?
I don't know. We talked about this in a different podcast, and I said I don't get the post competition blues. For the most part, I don't. I did have maybe 2 or 3 days where I felt kind of melancholy, and I don't know if I really processed why. But I don't know if I would even call it the post contest blues, because honestly, going into the show, I think I told you at some point this show is the least of my worries and the least things stressing me out right now. It's just because we had so much other stuff going on, namely my job situation. It's not like my current job is in jeopardy, but I mean, long story short, I'm a contractor right now with Microsoft, and they kind of, maybe there's a little dishonesty around it, but it's well, we don't have any full-time positions open. So I'm great. I'm a contractor in a job that I don't particularly like. It pays great right now, but it's we just moved into this nice house and we have took on some extra debt. I'm well, what am I going to do here? And the interviews, I've been in interviews for a couple of months now with different companies, and it's all stuff to where if my mind had been not occupied with prep and I wasn't half brain dead, I probably could have done better. But I kept kind of missing the mark on all these interviews. I'm shit, what's gonna happen with this? so yeah, all that stuff was basically stressing me out, and I think maybe that had more to do with why. Because like I finished the show and I got in this food that I was like looking forward to make me feel better, and like physically it made me feel better for like a day, and then after that I was like, well, shit, right back into the fire with all these other stressors. Now, a week removed
Yeah.
from that, I feel much better, and I already felt much better. And then just I think I told you, I mean, I'm getting an offer from Amazon, so. Things are looking up in that regard, and not like I want to be a W-2 employee for any longer than I have to be, but for now, that's having a good job is really beneficial. So, yeah, I guess things are looking up now. I had a few days of blues, but I mean, what you said about everything having purpose, like I kind of approach the off season that way too, and this is how I do a lot of things in life, and it's like almost like I'll just say it like almost autistically. Like, I'm sorry if anyone gets offended by that, but actually we joke, but like not really joking. I'm probably somewhere on the spectrum anyway. But like if I like approach a goal and I say, well, I need to do X, Y, Z to accomplish the goal, I will just be like, it will become the thing that has to get done.
Oh, it is. He is so laser focused to the point where, like, when we first started dating, so
Yeah.
we started dating with like 3 weeks of us dating. I was in Colorado, he was in Kansas. I moved in with him, and I was like, oh my god, he has these. I have no idea how to handle this person, and it's been really good for us to figure out
I've loosened up a bit since then.
a lot.
Well, that's kind of the nice thing about bodybuilding training. Like I'm kind of a prima donna about my training with bodybuilding, but I also know you can get a good session in almost anywhere if you're a little bit flexible. With powerlifting, it was like I got to have this bar, this rack at this time. All my orthopedic shit has to be spot on because I'm going to hurt myself if it's not. So things have freed up a little bit in that regard. And so the thing that you really have to be anal about is your meals. And thankfully, we're both in a position where we have quite a bit of flexibility in that regard. I mean, we're very busy, but I work from home. I can get up and get my meal whenever I want. So I can be laser focused without it being as much a detriment to my life and Dani's as it probably was the case a few years ago. But yeah, like I was saying, it's if I have the blues, it's for a very short time because now I'm like, all right, I've had 2 off seasons where I gained somewhere between literally 15 and 30 pounds of stage weight. I want to make that happen again, and I know it happened the first 2 times because I treated it with that much urgency. So
That's a perfect like kind of wrapping things up. We talk about having goals. Like, why did you gain 15 to 30 pounds? Because because every meal all year, and that's the biggest thing where I see with people like, yeah, I want to turn pro. And it's like, well, what did you eat on for meal 3 on Tuesday of March 4th? Where you would be like, well, let me think back. And like people be like, I don't know what I ate this Tuesday, and that's the difference. There's no like, everyone has like these goals and they're way out in the future, and there's so much that happens between them, but that there's a path towards that goal, and if you put your focus and do that every day, things build up really quickly. I used to, when I was first starting, like trying to start Troponin nutrition, and I didn't know anything about, this is 20 years ago, like there weren't even like really platforms to build a website, and so I had no idea like really. So my thing was, every day I'm just going to do one thing. And, some days you do more, but no matter what, even if like we were traveling and we didn't get home till 10:30 at night and I had to work in the morning, doesn't matter. That's some progress forward. And then eventually, I was 20 years ago. 20 times 365, that's a lot of things, and things do add up, and time's going to pass. I always say, like, this most, like my overweight clients, my clients who are non-competitors, it's the hardest for them because if you're 350 pounds, you have a long time before you're at your goal. But I always say, time's going to pass either way. Like COVID was 3 years ago almost now. Time passes. It's going to be 2 years from now, one way or the other. In 2 years, and it's going to happen like this when it's 2 years from now. And in 2 years, you can be in the shape that you want to be, living the life you want to be, or not. But either way, it's going to happen. And now that seems way far off right now, and you don't want to do these things with the diet that you don't want to do because it's so far off. But I can guarantee when that 2 years passes, which is going to be a blink of an eye at that time, you're going to be really angry that you didn't do the things that could have had you at your goal. Because like every present was some future, and the only reason your present isn't where you're at, not at your goals currently, is because you didn't treat it like the present.
It's funny, Justin. I imagine you're probably the same way. Like I have, as much as I have the capacity to laser focus and work hard on something, I also have like an alarming capacity for laziness, to where like something can either happen at twice the rate anyone expects it to and go awesome, or it can just never happen.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I don't have. I think Dave Tate always used to say like he knows where 0%
Yeah.
is and hundred
Yeah.
percent is. It doesn't, and I think a lot of people in the sport, especially in my experience, people who come to the sport from like a powerlifting background or maybe a wrestling background, there's no, it's like on or off, you know. And I'm definitely that same way. I mean, I can sit and think, like like in Ghostbusters when they're up there with Zool and they have to not think anything, and Dan Aykroyd thinks to the Stay Puft Marshmallow
Yep.
Man. Is that
Yeah.
was it? Yeah, Stay Puft, right? Yeah, I would have passed out with flying colors. I could
Yeah.
shut completely off and think
Yeah.
nothing.
Look, that's why taking it easy in training is hard, even when you know you should. I'm like, I know how to go and train hard or not go to the gym.
Yeah, it feels like, and well, that could be a good segue to our next the training volume or frequency segment. But yeah, I always struggled with that because I really had to turn the deloads into a goal. You have to realize while you're doing it. But even then, especially because if you like training, and I think people come from a powerlifting background or like a athletic or strength background where you train originally you go to the gym because of performance, to improve your performance, and so the gym has real world metrics and real world applications to what you're trying to do, which isn't so much the case with bodybuilding. Like you said, powerlifting is training, bodybuilding is eating. That's really what it is. You have to train obviously, but the eating is what dictates everything. The training is, there's a whole range of things you can do in the gym that will produce pretty close to maximal results, provided your eating is perfect. But the eating's always has to be there. But like it's really hard when you like training and you want to go in and lift heavy and you don't get to.
Yeah.
That's really hard, I think. But if you want to segue to our next topic, we've been getting a lot of questions on training volume and frequency, and I've been seeing this pop up. I don't know if a big name in one of the physique or bodybuilding, if there's some big name out there that's training 7 days a week, but it seems like that's coming back into phase again. And I have a client right now who's like insisted on training 7 days a week, and I told them it wasn't going to be optimal, and they told me they were going to burn out, and of course they didn't listen, and of course now they are burned out. And that's, I think, the hardest thing to kind of grasp early on, is because you think, especially like you watch movies like you watch G.I. Jane, and the way she gets in shape during buds is to work out after they, like the stuff that doesn't make any sense at all. Or you watch like Rocky, it's always like the training is where the growth happens, and it's not. The training is where the opposite. The training is where everything gets broken down. But if there's it's the hardest, and I never know how to word it properly. I think I have a good way of wording as far as volume per session, because you can work through it like we always try to do first principles. If you work through training volume in a session by first principles, and you say I'm currently doing 0 sets. I want to get a bigger chest. I'm doing 0 sets. Now if I go in and do 1 set of bench press, I'm going to grow more than if I did 0 sets. Makes sense. If I do 2, I'm going to grow more than if I did 1. If I do a warm up and I do 3 sets, I'm probably going to grow more than if I did 2. And that kind of continues until you reach a point where, and I think everyone that trains is at this point. They say, I can't guarantee that adding another set on any workout is going to guarantee a linear increase in muscle growth. And all of us, I think, can say that. And so if we're in that range, we are probably already training to the point where now the limiting factor is whether our nutrition is good enough to cover the training maximally for maximal growth. And at that point, adding more training does nothing to help growth. It can help keep you leaner. And we talked earlier before we started recording about John Meadows training 7 days a week, where he was almost treating it for that reason, like a version of cardio. But that's a totally different thing than adding muscle. And in my experience, all the truly, truly huge chunks of growth have been all 4 or 5 days a week training, and a lot of times 4 times, but really never more than 5 days a week training. And I've never seen anyone grow faster on 6 or 7 days a week training than 4 or 5 ever. And
there are
20
there are
some
more
years
than
ago.
enough anecdotes basically prove this. I mean, people who are obsessed with, using the scientific method and peer-reviewed literature are going to balk at the word prove here. But I can't think of a single, super heavyweight bodybuilder or very large pro who's trained more than probably 5 days a week. And not only that, most of them aren't doing an excessive amount of volume within those sessions. I can kind of think of a couple of exceptions, but even then, it's like the guys who are the biggest, and Justin, I think we talked about this on the show recap, like they're eating a ridiculous amount of food and they don't look like they're necessarily trying to like compensate for that food consumption with really ridiculous volume. I mean, their volume will be like moderate, especially in the off season when their volume will be a little higher when they're really well fed, but they're not doing like these crazy 20 or 30 set leg workouts. They're doing what needs to be done, creating a stimulus and eating to cover it and then some by a little bit.
It seems like nowadays, we've talked about this before. Years ago, you just had the magazines, so it was basically whatever Weeder fed you is what you believed. You didn't know any different. Where now we have everyone's on video doing their actual workouts, eating their actual meals. It's like there's no mystery anymore. There should be no, even if you don't want to understand the science or don't, like because it's easy to think the working out's building the muscle. It's not, but even if you get in that thought process, you can follow anyone who's made truly incredible size gains. You can see, I mean, you've seen Nick Walker since he was a kid. You saw him 100 pounds of muscle ago. You saw Ian Villardi, I can never say his last name. Since you've seen him come. You saw Jordan Peters from when he was like a spiky haired, like club boy in like 2012. You've seen these guys add 120, 130 pounds of muscle, and you've seen their training, and it's all the same. I mean, not the same, but pretty darn close. It's all, you've seen them progressively get remarkably stronger on a limited volume capacity, where the workload is focused on basically the intensity of the main sets rather than the workload as far as just throwing volume at And there's a point in volume, and Paul Barnett from Anabolic Bodybuilding is going to be listening to this because he's been making better gains with higher volume. I think partly his age plays a role in that also. But in their sarcoplasmic stuff, you can see guys aren't doing 20 sets for chest 3 days a week, and so that all this is out there in plain view for everyone to see, and there's still like a debate about it among the young kids.
I think people kind of forget that at the heart, training, we think about the muscles, right? Like we think about, cool, we're putting like mechanical tension on the muscle, yada yada yada, and it's a very reductionist way of looking at things where we kind of forget that there's this whole hormonal and enzymatic pathway that happens. There's way more physiology that goes on than just, stimulate the muscle. And like that's what we need to do in the broadest sense. But I think people kind of forget that, like, whether you do 10 sets or 20 sets, you're just trying to tap into certain pathways. That's it. Mm-hmm. And your body doesn't know the difference between one stack on the cable station or the other. It's going to know tension. That tension is what's going to drive all the cellular processes. I mean, like, I don't want to be a super nerd because at the end of the day, we love to train. But like at the end of the day, like, that's what training is doing. It's stimulating the physiology behind the adaptation required to move the weight that you have asked your body to move.
Yeah. There was I can't remember what the overall video was about, but Mike Israetel put out a video. And for anyone who doesn't know, like Mike Israetel, Renaissance Periodization, they put out a lot of good training content. I don't agree with all their stuff, and I think Dani and I both don't take the same approach to training volume that they do. But they put out a lot of good stuff. And what Israetel said is that when you're training, your goal is basically signal transduction, which is you are sending a message to your cell to do a thing. And I think it's easy to kind of take a more simplistic or reductionist view and to too closely associate the feeling of your training with what's going to happen to your muscles that day and days beyond. It's like, this is why people probably obsess over the pump more often too much than not enough. Because you think, oh, well, my biceps got pumped, so they got bigger temporarily, so they will be bigger a week from now, a month from now, whatever. And maybe there's a little bit to that. I'm not saying there's nothing to pump training, but it's not the meat and potatoes of getting bigger.
Well, I think Chris Beardsley, for anyone who doesn't follow him, Chris Beardsley on Instagram does a lot of evidence review, and he actually has some really, really good science of hypertrophy stuff. And I'm pretty sure he just posted something the other day looking at the role of pump training, or the feeling of a pump with the associated actual hypertrophy, and it was very, very minimal.
Yeah. And as far as if they're looking at like contractile tissue, like when you say hypertrophy, meaning there's actual protein structures being built on top of protein
Yeah.
structures, I would, yeah, probably close to zero. You know, I mean, there, you could argue like some sarcoplasmic benefit, and I think there's a real benefit to that because I think that's the prime reason why bodybuilders look different than powerlifters, and it is a different look. You can tell when someone lifts heavy, even bodybuilders. There's a denser, thicker, there's some kind
That's
of
this
harder look.
guy.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell. You can, you know, and it's definitely a better look on stage. I mean, Ronnie and Coleman's a perfect example about it. There was just something
Yeah.
different about, or Branch. There's a different look to the muscle than someone who's, you know, has that same roundness, but it's, you know, it's not filled
It's
with
super cool being
thick
around like
contractile
Martin
tissue.
Fitzwater because he trains with Branch, and he does kind of a combination of everything where he lifts pretty heavy. He's really freaking
He's
strong.
really strong, yeah.
He's super strong. But he also does some of like the pretty boy pumpy stuff, and like his look, like you see these people online, you're like, yeah, he's really big.
No,
You see him in person, and you're like, holy
I
crap,
mean,
he's enormous.
he's like dense and bubbly all at the same time.
Yeah, he jokes. Yeah, he's anyway.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't mean to derail from the original topic, but it's kind of interesting that we got in this talk of like, you know, myofibrillar or like hypertrophy actually creating new protein structures versus sarcoplasmic. Because I think I won't say I've got judges' feedback because to be honest, I didn't ask them yet. But I think the feedback I got from other people at the show was like, you know, one, okay, great, you were very ripped, but two, like you don't have the fullness that we might want from someone who's about 5'9" and 235 on stage. I think some of that's just my structure. Like I've got long limbs, so I've got more tissue to fill out. But and I think Dani probably had something to say about this too. Like I have a lot of density, and you can tell that I have lifted heavy, but there's like a certain amount of roundness and fullness that I'm missing, and I could probably improve my look a lot even without gaining a lot of stage weight. So do you think that's the case?
That's yeah, that's exactly like 100%. Because I know the same thing. Because you see your weight. Well, I was the same way. I was always the heaviest. Like every show I ever did, I'm pretty sure I was the heaviest competitor
Yeah.
in the entire show, even like the USA's. And I wasn't, as far as like spatial, who took up space on stage. You know, like volume of their muscle.
Right.
I don't know. I wouldn't say I was the largest. And I think it's from that heavy lifting because the majority of your muscle tissue is pure contractile tissue, which has a really different look, a harder look, a real, you know, it looks like a bowling ball versus like a beach ball. It is a different look. But then when you can add, this is probably like a perfect like combo with our 3D look topic from the other week, would be like that rate. There's only so
Yeah.
much myofibrillar growth you're going to get, you know, because we know where the cap is. Basically, where bodybuilding has been for almost 30 years, since the mid 90s. You know, the real guys haven't really added real tissue since then. You know, you look like Dorian in 1993, 30 years ago, essentially, has as much tissue, pretty much contractile tissue, as anybody. And so that 3D look, I think that'll start developing is now those sarcoplasmic things are going to continue to happen because you have so little of that because you were a power lifter up until a couple of years ago. So you have your advanced bodybuilder as far as, you know, contractile tissue size and density. You are novice, you know, like guy, you know, basically 19-year-old kid who's been training
Yeah.
for 2 years.
Do you think that it really requires that much of a change in the way that a person trains, or is it just really more a matter of time?
I think it's time. I think if you had been training the way you're currently training the last 2 or 3 years for 12 or 13 years, you would have it no matter what. You know, I don't think like I'm not a big fan of even if it was really training dependent. I don't think you would enjoy that type of training. So I still wouldn't recommend someone changing to that because you're not going to train. You know, I always say like because the diet is the diet, like it's numbers, macros. You know, it's like what training is for powerlifting. It doesn't if you want to be a powerlifter, it doesn't matter whether you like the training. You have to hit numbers, and it has to be planned out. But bodybuilding is the diet. So for bodybuilding, the diet, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. We have to hit these numbers. You can try to find foods you like to hit those numbers, but training is more emotional in bodybuilding, meaning like you have to enjoy it. If you don't
I agree
enjoy
and I
it, you're
disagree.
not going to get the benefit.
We talked about this a little bit with Dave, where he is so strict on a lot of his movements. Where if you think about something like a back muscle, right? If you are asking for it to both stabilize the spinal segment and move, something like a shoulder blade or a scap, you're asking for it to perform a dual role that's probably going to inhibit how well it performs both of those roles rather than maximizing one or the other. Does that make sense? So for a lot of Dave's back movements, what I suggested was
Yep.
have one or two movements that you're like super strict on, but then have a couple that, because if you watch him training, I mean, his lines are perfect, and you can almost see him like fighting himself to maintain perfect positions. And I think that at some point that becomes detrimental because you're not allowing the muscle to fully lengthen and fully shorten, even if it is a little bit cheaty. So even if you are cheating and getting a little bit of body English in the last, 25% of the motion, you're still getting the overload, you're still getting the tension, you're still getting the full shortening, and especially if it allows you to achieve a full lengthening, you're removing the competition of roles between stabilizing and moving.
It's funny you put it that way because about the conflict between stabilizing and actually moving weight. Because I think kind of like just for an example, the way I thought maybe I should change my back training like a little bit is rather than being super strict on every movement, like on one of my back days, like pick a couple movements to stay super strict and just focus on getting a lot of tension. And the movements I've picked for that are the ones that are like seated or chest supported, or basically where the apparatus is doing a lot of the bracing for me, and that's probably going to allow for more output. Like in this case, it's the hammer pull down and the prime, like the extreme row, like the bent over, that awesome row. And then the ones where I get a little cheaty are the seated cable stuff, where you do have to stay. I mean, it's a cable movement. But you have to use your back to stabilize. So if I get a little more cheaty on that, that's.
When you think about the resistance profile on those machines too, right? To where something like the hammer pull down, yes, you have the external stability of the machine, but you're also getting external stability via the counter force that you provide into the machine via internal tension from your body. So like what you're pushing into the machine. So you're still stabilizing from somewhere else, even if you are having, let's say you're working your left lat and you're looking at where the lat attaches its spine in the ilium. Yeah, you don't want those things to move. But you're getting enough counter force from the machine and from being able to stabilize with your other arm. Versus something like the cable row through a range or through a varying strength curve. Versus something on the cable row where like you're going to be more dependent on the strength curve based on muscle length rather than the machine setup. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's so hard in the shortened position. So.
Right, but like like the prime row, for example, is going to be harder in the range of motion based on where you load it.
Right.
Compared to something like a cable where really what's going to you're not affected by the strength curve of the machine so much as you are the internal length tension of the muscle. Does that make sense?
No.
So how about the step back row? The step back row is going to be harder or easier in certain positions based on the trajectory of the actual weight.
Sure.
Okay? You're not going to face that issue with the cable row because it's going in the same pathing and the resistance, as much as it's cable, it's like relatively static. Does that make more sense?
Sure.
Okay.
I feel like you got a glimpse into your marriage. I don't think I was in the
Sorry,
conversation for a little bit there.
This is
So I guess
5
if we
days
call
out
it,
per
we
train.
bring it
Watching
together.
a
I think
TV
the
show.
TLDR of that is that I don't think my training needs to change a ton, but it could probably benefit from changing a little bit. And for instance, like getting a little bit sloppier actually on some movements. And I think we might have actually been talking about this over text or something. Like the guys with like the not just the thickest, but like the bubbliest backs, for example. They do a variety of movements, and they're not, textbook on all of them. They're the kind of guys where they'll post a video of them like rowing ridiculous weight with like OK form, and a bunch of guys that weigh 150 pounds will be criticizing them. It's like, do you think that they didn't? Do you think they didn't try everything? I think that's like a pet peeve of mine. Like people look at bodybuilders and they just.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about how like like being dumb kind of helps in bodybuilding because you don't overthink. But there's this thought that like every bodybuilder is just dumb and they're just doing whatever they're doing because for no reason. It's like, well, if they're a professional and they've gotten this far, they've probably tried a lot of things. So you can take some clues.
Yeah, well, yeah, I can tell you, if you see someone rowing, bent over rowing 500 pounds,
Yeah.
that didn't happen by accident. That wasn't like, there was a long buildup where they tried a lot of things, It's like, it's like someone like seeing a Formula One driver, and being like, oh yeah, well, if he drove differently, he could drive way faster. Like, you don't think the guy's tried everything?
Or it's like
at
even
this point?
really good bodybuilders who are making money off the sport. Like, oh, so you think that they're taking the extra risk of injury and putting their money at risk just because? It's like probably not.
Yeah. Good point. Yep. Yeah, that always cracks me up. It's like, because, well, I don't post videos that often, but when I do, there's always someone will be like, have you tried? It's like, I got my first weight set in like 1986. Yes, I have tried. I mean, I don't remember a time I didn't work out. From my from childhood, I can't remember a time where I didn't, there's nothing I haven't tried. There's no grip, there's no body position, there's no, and if there is, I will try soon enough because I mean, I guess over time you slowly get like pigeonholed into patterns and stuff, but still, even then, there's a lot of days and a lot of workouts where
We
you,
don't
you
realize
try a lot of things over the
you don't
years.
know what you don't know. Like you don't know what you haven't tried because you don't know it exists. So like when we were out at Elite and I had you in the chest supported row and I said, hey, try this first, and you're like, oh wow, like that's my mid back. You had no idea you hadn't tried that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it goes the other direction too. Like these people that are obsessing over strict form.
Oh my god.
You like you.
The 130-pound dudes that wear stringers.
Yeah, I think part of it though is that so many people like there's like this culture that doesn't exist anymore of like you go to the gym and you learn from the big guys and then
Yeah.
and it's so much easier to learn things in person like that. And so you have this generation of lifters who only learn over the internet. And even if they're learning it from someone good, it's like there's only so much you can do to like explain to someone unless they're working with you one on one and really like understanding what's wrong with you or what's wrong with your technique. And so it's a lot easier to just tell someone like, look, this is super strict form. You keep all these positions perfect and you pull these muscles and you make sure these muscles only are working. That's pretty easy to teach relatively speaking. Whereas it's really difficult to learn how to row with like a little bit of body English and still get a great contraction in your back and then get a good eccentric and then repeat that for 10 reps and actually approach failure. Like that's something that you really have to like learn over time.
Yeah, well, I think you guys are using very specific words that I think is different than what
Mm-hmm.
like people on the internet use. You're saying very strict form, which like that's a
Good.
proper way to talk
Right.
about it. What you
Right.
hear on the internet is people will call that good form,
Mm.
and that's good for what? Is if you're trying to build muscle, the guy that weighs 320 pounds with abs seems to be, that form seems to be good or gooder than what you're doing because and so that I think that's the important thing is and then really like more and more the data are like kind of showing that what bodybuilders have done all along really they like what they stumbled upon for hypertrophy with more explosive lifting, a little bit of body English, more explosive positive or concentric portion of the movement, you know a slow controlled but really no more wasted energy on the eccentric other than to avoid injury and control the rep and then not really locking out basically the
Don.
way Branch and Ronnie
Yeah.
and Jay and Phil and everyone, the Brad Schoenfeld posted a couple recent research studies that showed like the rate of muscle protein synthesis and the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis following training like that compared to training with slower controlled reps with a pause at lockout and so like it's really kind of panning out in real world data now. I mean it has in real world data if you consider
Yeah.
bodybuilding a real world for decades, but
I guess to bring it around to the topic that originally got us on all this, we were talking about training 7 days a week or this excessive training, and I think I don't like there's like no argument that could be good for building muscle, but to get to the other reason you might do it, which is to promote fat loss or kind of use it as a replacement for cardio, like I'm curious to see what you say, Justin, but personally, I don't even think that's a very good idea because if I'm in a prep and I want to do what I can to maintain the quality of the training that I am doing, and if anything, that's going to take me in the opposite direction. Like I would just as soon keep training as close to the same as the off season as I can, while upping cardio because cardio is like it's going to have a less of a recovery cost. Even HIIT is going to have less of a recovery cost.
yeah. And you get, I mean, and there's the like as far as calorie burning, you get what you get what you put in. Like a set of 700 pounds for six on deadlifts is going to burn a lot more calories than 5 sets of cable pull downs,
Yeah.
like 3 or 4 reps short of failure. You know what I mean? It really is. Like as far as what is actually uh, well, and just in general, I always try to make analogies because like especially science things, they're big words, they're difficult concepts, and so if you can break it down to an analogy, and the analogy is never going to hold 100% true, but kind of the analogy that I've like kind of used for a while for training and bodybuilding and eating is try to think of like someone building a home. And you have the general contractor as your training. You know, they decide what part of the home you're working on, how long you're working on that part of the home, and all those things. So they decide, you know, how long you're training, what type of training you're doing, what muscle group you're working on. And so they tell the workers where to work. And that is what training does. And then the workers, like how many workers you have is kind of your ability to recover or process that training. And that's where, you know, anabolic and PEDs come into play, because the more workers you have, the better that general contractor can delegate the work. But there's a third part of the thing too, materials. You know, you need the wood, you need the nails, you need the screws, you need the spackle, and that's the food. And so all those things have to come into play. And so you can, if you have the right amount of food, you well planned out supply chain stuff, you got all the lumber you need, and you're on PEDs and you have plenty of workers, the foreman or the general contractor still has to dictate where people go. And now he can overwork, you know, like you do more volume. I can tell my employees to work 20 hours a day or 24 hours a day, 7 days, you know, there's a limit. And that's kind of with the training. You can do all that training, but you have to realize what else is involved with it. You know, that training isn't building the house. That training is telling what the workers and the materials, what part of the house to build. If you're working on 20 hours a day, you're going to run out of materials, or you're going to burn out the workers, which is basically the lack of recovery. There is a limit. There is a limiting factor in that. There's only so much so, you know, you basically, the optimal range would be probably like the 40-hour work week. You know, you target those guys effectively for 40 hours, have all the supplies they need to be productive and effective for those 40 hours. And then after that, you let them go home and rest and eat so they can come back and work again tomorrow.
Have you ever upped somebody's volume when they were like on a diet for the sake of fat loss? Yeah.
Not even when
Usually
you're really
if I get really
mad
mad at them, I have them do circus tricks. I'm just kidding. Oh, not really, actually. My clients will be like, what the fuck is this movement? And I'm like, have fun, PT.
For more content like this, visit www.teamtroponin.com.
This video is brought to you by First Attachment Nutrition, battle-tested nutrition, expert formulated supplements. Join the First Attachment revolution.